Hi everyone. This is Dr. Victoria Nalule. And in today's discussion, I want to talk about mitigation and adaptation with respect to climate change. So the climate change is happening. Different countries are experiencing different climate change impacts, including droughts, floodings. But the question is, how can we reduce on the greenhouse gas emission? So that takes us to mitigation. How can you mitigate, reduce on the greenhouse gas emissions? And then how can we adapt to the impacts associated to climate change? That takes us to adaptation. So mitigation and adaptation are some of the two most important concepts or principles when we're talking about climate change. Because on the other hand, you have to first agree that climate change is there. And once you agree that climate change is there, and you also agree with the definition of climate change, remember I already talked about the different skepticism about climate change. So if you believe that climate change is there and it's caused due to human activity, then you have to find ways of mitigating, reducing on the greenhouse gas emission. How can you reduce or how can you avoid it? And then the other thing is, once you also realize that there are impacts associated with climate change that we are already experiencing or that we are likely to experience in future, then you have to ask yourself, how can we prepare ourselves to adapt to these impacts? So in summary, that is what we call mitigation and adaptation. And just to share my slides with you. So that's basically it about mitigation and adaptation. That's the basic introduction of what it is, what it entails, and why it's important when it comes to climate change. So let's start with mitigation. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change defines mitigation as an anthropogenic intervention to reduce the sources or enhance the sinks of greenhouse gases. So according to the IPCC, mitigation is defined as an anthropogenic intervention. So it's an intervention to reduce the sources of greenhouse gases. So that is mitigation. It's an intervention to reduce the sources of greenhouse gases. But in simple terms, mitigation is focused on reducing on climate change or reducing on greenhouse gas emissions. It involves reducing the flow of heat trapping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere by reducing the sources of these gases. So in simple terms, mitigation is focused at reducing the sources of the greenhouse gas emissions. And then adaptation, on the other hand, it's defined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effects. In human systems, adaptation seeks to moderate or avoid harm or exploit beneficial opportunities. So adaptation is just about adjusting to the actual or expected climate change impacts. So like I already mentioned, you have to first ask yourself, what is this climate change? What is the causes of climate change? And what are the impacts of climate change? And once you have finalized with the what is climate change, what are the causes, what are the impacts, then you ask yourself, how can we reduce on the climate change, or how can we reduce on the greenhouse gas emissions? And you ask yourself, if the impacts are there, how can we adjust to these impacts? So that takes us to the relationship between mitigation and adaptation. The relationship starts by acknowledging that climate change is there, but it doesn't only stop at acknowledging, but you also have to understand what is causing this climate change. And once you have acknowledged that climate change is there and you know what is causing climate change, you ask yourself, how can we reduce on the causes of climate change? Or in summary, how can we reduce on the greenhouse gas emissions? So that is the mitigation. And then you have to ask yourself, what are the impacts of climate change? What are the effects that we are already experiencing or that we are likely to experience? So that takes us to adaptation. And once you know the impacts or the effects, you ask yourself, how can we adapt? How can we adjust our lives to be able to live with these impacts associated with climate change? So that takes us to adaptation. So mitigation and adaptation, they are closely related because at the heart of mitigation and adaptation is the need to recognize what climate change is, what causes climate change, and recognizing the impacts of climate change. So if you move on to Article 3, Clause 3 of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it states that the parties should take precautionary measures to anticipate, prevent, or minimize the causes of climate change and mitigate its adverse effects. So this article points us to the aspect of mitigation, whereby it's requiring the parties to the convention to take precautionary measures to anticipate, prevent, or minimize. So prevent and minimize, they basically link to mitigation, the causes of climate change, and mitigate. Actually, the article specifically even talks about mitigate its adverse effects. So this article, it's one of the legal provisions that points to the issue of mitigation. It further goes ahead to say that where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty should not be used as a reason for postponing such measures, taking into account that policies and measures to deal with climate change should be cost effective so as to ensure global benefits at the lowest possible costs. To achieve this, such policies and measures should take into account different socioeconomic contexts, be comprehensive, cover all relevant sources, sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases and adaptation, and comprise all economic sectors. Efforts to address climate change may be carried out cooperatively by interested parties. So Article 3, Clause 3 basically mentions the need for countries to take measures to mitigate the various impacts associated with climate change. Then if we move on to Article 4, Clause 1, if it says that the developed country parties and other developed parties included in Annex 2 shall also assist the developing country parties that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change in meeting costs of adaptation to those adverse effects. So we noticed that climate change, if we are to talk about adaptation, how countries can adjust to the various impacts associated with climate change, it requires finances, it requires lots of money, it is a costly process. And as such, under Article 4, they recognize the fact that adaptation is a very expensive venture. And as such, for the developing countries that do not have the resources, they can be assisted by the developed countries. But the question might be, is this even an effective provision? Because remember also the developed countries we have seen in recent years, they are struggling with climate change impacts. And whatever contribution they're making, is it effective to really ensure that developing countries adapt to the climate change impacts that they're experiencing? Or are there other measures that should be taken to ensure that the finances are made available for the developing countries that have to adapt to the extreme weather conditions caused by climate change? So moving forward, we have already talked about mitigation at an international level, but international treaties are not effective in implementing these mitigation measures or even adaptation measures at the national level. As such, you need legal frameworks that have been formulated at the national level, and these legal frameworks have to be tailored enough to be able to take into consideration the unique challenges faced by countries when it comes to mitigation and adaptation. As such, national mitigation measures they are often included in the national climate change laws, as we shall see. And these are very important for countries to set their own goals on how to mitigate climate change. And this has to also take into consideration the different sectors of the economy, because remember, with climate change, the definition, that legal definition, points to human activity as being one of the sources of the greenhouse gas emission causing the climate change we're experiencing. So with mitigation, you need to look at the different sectors of the economy and ask yourself, how can we reduce on the greenhouse gas emissions? So you look at the energy sector and understand the different types of energy, be it fossil fuels, including oil, gas, and coal, or renewables, or nuclear, and ask yourself, how can we reduce the greenhouse gas emissions in the fossil fuel sector? In sense, how can we decarbonize the energy sector? Then you move on to the transport sector and also ask yourself, how can we decarbonize the transport sector? Are we supposed to move towards electric vehicles? Is that an issue that will be effective? What about the various other transport sectors like airplanes? What should be done when it comes to, mitigating the greenhouse gas emissions that come from the transport sector? Then the construction sector, you also have to ask yourself whether the buildings are sustainable, or if there are some greenhouse gas emissions from the building sector or the construction sector. And when you're talking about mitigation, the question has to be, how can we reduce on those greenhouse gas emissions in the different sectors of the economy? So there are various practical ways of achieving mitigation, but the first thing to do is to look at a particular sector and ask yourself the various mitigation measures that can be taken to reduce on the climate change impacts on those sectors, or to reduce on the greenhouse gas emissions. In recent years, specifically in the energy sector, we have seen the energy transition, where different countries are now trying to shift from fossil fuels to renewables. That's one of the mitigation measures to ensure that you're reducing on the greenhouse gas emission coming from the energy sector. And scholars and various experts are of the view that one way of doing that is to shift from fossil fuels to renewables. But the question also arises, if you're to shift from fossil fuels to renewables, are you sure that the economies will run, or it's something that we are likely to achieve, but at the detriment of the economy and at the detriment of other sectors of the economy? So that is something that really also has to be asked and taken into consideration. The other thing is decarbonization, like I mentioned. Decarbonization is very key in ensuring mitigation, because decarbonizing the various sectors of the economy ensures that you're reducing on the greenhouse gas emission, which is the essence of mitigation when it comes to climate change. Another thing is the issue of energy efficiency, especially in the energy sector, and also for the construction sector, ensuring sustainable designs for the buildings, sustainable designs that will reduce on the greenhouse gas emissions in the construction sector. And then for the transport sector, the introduction of electric vehicles in different countries is one of the mitigation measures to decarbonize the transport sector. And then the other important thing is changing consumer behavior. How are the consumers behaving, or what type of products are they buying? And can they put pressure on the producers to ensure that whatever they're producing is sustainable, and the measures taken to mitigate or reduce on the greenhouse gas emission? The other important thing is forestation, planting more trees, because trees are also important as they act as carbon sinks. And a carbon sink, as you can see in the slide, it's anything that absorbs more carbon from the atmosphere than it releases. So planting more trees, it's one of the ways to mitigate the various negative impacts associated with climate change, or to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Then another thing we talked about, especially for the fossil fuel sector, is the use of clean technologies such as carbon capture and storage. So new technologies are essential to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. And they are also another form of mitigation. For instance, carbon capture and storage, carbon capture and storage ensures that the carbon dioxide is captured from industrial processes such as steel and cement production, or from the burning of fossil fuels in power generation. So with this type of technology, whereas some companies might be extracting fossil fuels, if they do employ carbon capture and storage, it will be a mitigating process or measure to capture the carbon that is released in the atmosphere. So that's also one way of ensuring that we rely on innovation and new technologies to mitigate the climate change that we're experiencing. So in this graph, we just simply illustrate what carbon capture is. So this is like it's like a facility, and whatever carbon that is released from the industrial plants, it is stored or it is captured, and then it's injected to in a different storage or in a different facility. So whatever carbon that is released by a facility, it can be captured using the method of carbon capture and storage. And this could also be an effective way of mitigating the greenhouse gas emission released from such facilities. So we have already talked about mitigation at the international level, specifically looking at the United Nations framework on climate change. We also talked about the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now we want to talk about mitigation as illustrated in the 2015 Paris Agreement. So the 2015 Paris Agreement has a long-term goal of keeping the increase in global average temperature to below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So the goal of the 2015 Paris Agreement is to keep the increase of the global average temperature to below 2 degrees above pre-industrial level. And it aims to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees. So in a sense, it's pointing to mitigation, because mitigation is about reducing the greenhouse gas emission. And this is well stipulated in the 2015 Paris Agreement. And also the agreement recognizes the need for global emissions to peak as soon as possible, recognizing that this will take longer for developing countries. It undertakes rapid reductions in accordance with the best available science to balance emissions and removals in the second half of the century. So these are some of the aspects that are really recognized in the 2015 Paris Agreement, but the most important one, especially at the national level, is the nationally determined contributions, whereby countries, as a way of mitigating, they introduced the nationally determined contributions that embody efforts by each country to reduce national emissions and adapt the impacts of climate change. So one might ask themselves, like, for countries that have not contributed to these emissions, what exactly are they mitigating? Shouldn't they just focus on adaptation because they have not contributed to the greenhouse gas emission compared to the developed countries? And another person might even ask, is mitigation for only developed countries because they're the ones that have emitted lots of greenhouse gas emission gases? So should mitigation be focused to developed countries, and then adaptation can be focused more on the developing countries and also the developed countries? So those are some of the issues that have been out there for debate, because the developing countries, especially the countries in the global south, they haven't emitted as much as the developed countries. So what exactly are they mitigating? What measures should they put in place to mitigate when the countries that are responsible for this climate change should be doing all the mitigation, and then the developing countries focus on adaptation? So those are some of the questions that might be asked, especially when we're talking about mitigation and adaptation at a global level, because the countries haven't contributed equally when it comes to the emissions, but then you want them to take measures like as if they have contributed the way other countries have contributed. So mitigation has also faced lots of setbacks, especially for countries that feel that they haven't contributed to these greenhouse gas emissions, or they are not responsible for the climate change. So different countries have the NDCs, that is the nationally determined contributions. And if you look at the UK, it commits to reducing economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by at least 68% by 2030 compared to 190 levels. So the UK has ambitious plans to reduce the emissions by 68%. And the Kyoto Protocol also outlines the key mitigation mechanisms, including market-based mechanisms, emissions trading, joint implementation, and clean development mechanisms. So there are various mechanisms that countries can put into consideration as a way of mitigating or reducing on the emissions. So when you look at Article 17 of the Kyoto Protocol, it says that the Conference of the Parties shall define the relevant principles, modalities, rules, and guidelines, in particular for verification, reporting, and accountability for emissions trading. The parties included in Annex B may participate in emissions trading for the purposes of fulfilling their commitments. Under Article 3, any such trading shall be supplemental to domestic actions for the purposes of meeting quantified emission limitation and reduction commitments under that article. So Article 17 clearly talks about the need for countries to participate in emissions trading as a way of mitigation. So it just gives us some of the examples of mitigation that countries can focus on. So emission trading, what is it? It involves countries or companies trading in unused allocated carbon limits, carbon offsets from emissions reduction projects. It can be mandatory or voluntary, and it was first introduced in the USA under Article under the Clean Air Act of 1972. So it's mainly designed with specific industry focus, bearing targets for emissions and deadlines. So this is one of the mechanisms of ensuring mitigation, but remember there are various other mechanisms that countries can take, or even industries and companies, to mitigate or to reduce on the greenhouse gas emissions. Now let us start on the issue of adaptation. We already mentioned that with adaptation, you have to first recognize that climate change is there, and then know the impacts or effects associated with this climate change. Then afterwards, look at the measures on how the people, nature, and the environment can adjust to the impacts of climate change. The actual impacts, the impacts that we're already experiencing, and also the expected impacts. So with adaptation, you're looking at the actual impacts, what you're already experiencing, the droughts, the floods that are being experienced in different countries, and you ask yourself, how can people adjust to these impacts? And then also you have to take precautionary measures to think about the expected impacts that are likely to be experienced by different countries and different people due to climate change, and still have measures on how to adjust to such impacts. So like we mentioned, adaptation is very expensive because most countries are not ready for the impacts they're experiencing. They're not ready for the floods. They're not ready for the droughts, which has been causing famine. So the countries have to have money set aside to be able to address the negative impacts associated with climate change. And under the Kyoto Protocol, they introduced the Adaptation Funds. It basically finances climate change adaptation programs and projects for the vulnerable communities in developing countries, because adaptation is very expensive and some countries already have existing challenges. Their health challenges. Some countries don't have adequate health care services. They don't have adequate health centers. There are issues with transportation. Many people are dying of accidents because of poor roads or poor transport networks. Issues of education. Some countries are focused on education to ensure that there are more schools, enough schools, and affordable schools for their citizens. There are various challenges that are being experienced by different countries. So taking into consideration that these are the countries that are really more exposed to the impacts of climate change, like flooding and droughts, you have to think about the finances that can be used in the adaptation programs. And as such, in the Kyoto Protocol, they introduced the Adaptation Funds. But remember, there are also adaptation funds that have been introduced by the different national climate change acts in different countries. For instance, if you look at India, they established the India's National Adaptation Fund for Climate Change, which was established in 2015, and it aims to meet the cost of adaptation to climate change for the state and union territories of India that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. So this is one of the examples that adaptation doesn't only stop at the international level, but also at the national level. And if you look at the 2015 Paris Agreement as an international instrument, it also points us to adaptation by saying that countries have to enhance adaptive capacity and resilience, reduce vulnerability with a view to contributing to sustainable development, and also all parties are required to engage in adaptation planning and implementation. So the 2015 Paris Agreement really takes clear note, or it spotlights the importance of mitigation and adaptation as one of the ways for us to tackle the climate change that we're already experiencing. So what are the different adaptation strategies? How can we adjust? In the construction sector, for instance, it would require us erecting buildings and infrastructure that is safer and more sustainable to be sure that as we're experiencing the different impacts associated with climate change, the buildings are adjusted in a way that it's safer for us to go through whatever impacts we're experiencing. And then replanting forests and restoring damaged ecosystems is also another strategy that can be used in adapting to the impacts associated with climate change, and investigating and developing innovative solutions to prevent and manage natural catastrophes. That should also be another way or a strategy in that people and countries are ready to adapt to the impacts of climate change. You can refer to the different sectors and highlight the adaptation strategy that you think has to be taken. So what should adaptation do? What are the practical references of climate change impacts and adaptation? First, adaptation should protect people and places by making them less vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. If we take the example of the construction sector, the designers can consider relocating buildings to higher grounds to protect people against floodings and sea level rise. And then those are some of the practical things that adaptation has to be like. Those are some of the examples of the practical adaptation strategies that we can take looking at the exact impact of climate change. For instance, for floodings, we are saying in the construction sector, they can consider relocating buildings to higher grounds to protect people from flooding. So if you know your country is going to experience a flood and there is scientific evidence and data that let's say after 5 years, this region will experience a flooding, then it's better to plan ahead to adjust, to ensure that people adjust to whatever impacts are likely to be experienced in that region. So for adaptation, it should not only stop as a mechanism at the international level. We need to have clear adaptation strategies and policies at both the international level, but also at the national level. We need national adaptation plans and strategies. We need capacity building and information sharing so that people know what climate change impacts are already being experienced, what climate change impacts are expected to be experienced, and how to adjust those impacts that are actual, that we are experiencing already, or expected, that we expect to experience in the future. So you need to ask yourself how to adapt, and most importantly, access to finances. Access to finances and funding is very key to ensure that countries take measures to adapt or adjust to the impacts associated with climate change. So what can governments do to address climate change? Besides mitigation and adaptation, other measures should be taken, including investing more in research and also making finances available. The Adaptation Fund should be independent and it shouldn't be used for other things. It should only focus on climate change impacts, so that in case of any effects or impacts like flooding, droughts, countries are ready financially to adjust or to ensure that their people adjust to those impacts associated with climate change. So with mitigation and adaptation, it remains a very key concept, because at the end of the day, without this mitigation, without adaptation, many countries or many people are going to suffer the adverse impacts associated with climate change. So you have to mitigate, find ways of reducing on the greenhouse gas emission, and then also accept that different people or different countries are already experiencing the impacts associated with climate change, like floodings, droughts. So you have to prepare them to adjust to the actual impacts that you're already experiencing, or the impacts that we're expected to experience as a result of climate change. So thank you very much. That marks the end of our session on mitigation and adaptation. Show me.